Good morning, good early afternoon, and good evening. My name is Mahmoud Majien, Program Officer at Open Society Foundations, and thank you all for joining OSF's Global Drug Policy Program UN75 panel on race, COVID-19, and the war on drugs. It's been a tumultuous year, traumatic in many ways, but with a glimmer of hope in the largest wave of public protests since the Civil Rights Movement. This hope was born out of tragedy, a series of tragedies exacerbating the pervasive nature and the denial of our societies at the deadly effects of systemic racism in the Western world. We're here to discuss how the war on drugs acts as a conduit for structural racism, its internationalization to the same effect, the tireless work of activists on the ground, and what the UN must do, not could do, but must do, to address the continued criminal repercussions of our biased approaches to justice and law enforcement. And today we welcome Lord Simon Woolley, Executive Director of Operation Black Vote in the United Kingdom, Ms. Cassandra Frederique, Executive Director of the Drug Policy Alliance in the United States, Mr. Aquila Sherrills, Executive Director of Newark Street Team in New Jersey, USA, Ms. Sheila de Carvalho, Human Rights Lawyer with Coalição Negra por Direitos in Brazil, and last but not least, this panel is moderated by Dudun Doidien, former UN Special Rapporteur on Racism, Segregation, and Discrimination. There will be 2 rounds of discussion among the panelists, followed by a question and answer session with the audience. All questions are to be sent through the Q&A function on your screen. And with that, Mr. Dien, over to you.
Thank you very much, ma'am. I would like to first really thank and congratulate Open Society for the initiative, because this is very important in the present day context. So as an introduction, I just would like to share with you 3 central points in my view, which may impact on our discussion and on the issue we are discussing. The first point important is to keep in mind that racism is a construction. Racism is first of all an intellectual construction, and now it be followed by a political instrumentalization. That point is very important to keep in mind. The second point is that there are 3 factors now which are really promoting the expression of racism and the manifestation of racism. One is the centrality of the issue of identity. We are now living through an identity crisis, particularly in the Western world, because we are seeing the birth of a new multicultural identity. So the old national identities are resisting, and they are resisting by racism, coming back to the racist construction, etc. So this point of context is very important. The second point of context is that the issue of security is now becoming very important for many governments, and many governments and societies are linking identity and security, meaning that people who are not considered as a full part of the societies are a security issue and a security problem. So that factor of security, which target some criteria of identity, race, religion, etc., are giving a very strong push. The third issue now is that we are living also in a time of immigration, and immigration is very strong, and immigration is profoundly reshaping the society. So these 3 points, I think, are issues which are really pushing racism to be expressed on a more strong way. Now, my second introduction, my point to share with you, is that let us keep in mind that racism has 2 pillars. One is its construction, its ideology. The second one is its instruments. And in the instrument of racism, you have the law and order groups and mechanisms and institutions. And these 2 are very important. It means that even when what happened, in fact, historically, is that many societies have tried to fight against the ideology of racism. But the racism ideology has impacted the law and order institutions, and it remains very strong. And now my last point is that the impact of racism, the social, economical, mental, and psychological impact, which means that the victim of racism are fragilized very much in the society where they live. And being very fragilized, they are the target of law and enforcement and political groups who are now using racism as a platform. So I think that if we keep that in mind, we put the issue of drug in that context, because drug is expression of this dynamic and construction. So these are the point I would like to make. And if you agree, I give the floor now to Cassandra.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and I couldn't have said it better myself. And so, in moving in that context and understanding the context that race is playing an identity, we see that drugs is an expression of how we create policy choices and create policy narratives that use race as a way to control certain groups of people. And so the important thing about drug policy is that what we find is that they have taken an issue like drugs, one that has many different feelings around health, around social control, and they have used race as a way to control certain groups of people. So in the US context, we've seen that drug policies have only been the defining factor of drug policies and drug laws being passed has been focused on which group of people can those laws be used to control. So the first drug laws in the US were created to control Chinese migrants who had come to the US to build the railroads. And once they, in the US context of folks of color, we exploit your labor. After we exploit your labor, we can't figure out what to do with you. And so we figure out how to control you in this space. And we see that in the way that they've done that with folks of African descent with chattel slavery and Jim Crow and segregation and mass incarceration. We bring you here to exploit your labor. We use you as property. And then if you stay, we have a problem with that. So we have to figure out how do we build a political infrastructure to control that population. And drugs has been one of the most effective ways to do that in our country. So if you look at the substances like heroin and cocaine being strongly identified with Black Americans, you see marijuana, in the US, we call it marijuana, everyone else calls it cannabis. And part of that is because of the propaganda that they use, the racial propaganda that they use to scare white Americans by using a word that Southwest Mexicans were using to describe the substance. And so what we find is that not only has the drug laws been passed to control certain groups of people, but the institution of drug law enforcement in the recent century has really focused on how do we disrupt the political power of Black folks and how do we disrupt the anti-war left. And that has been evidenced by records that show that President Richard Nixon, who declared the war on drugs 50 years ago, that was the purpose of it. In fact, at the time that the drug laws were passed and we saw this infrastructure, super surge infrastructure of enforcement, drug use was going down. They were trying to put money in treatment. Their commissions on marijuana were showing that what the government was saying and what the scientists were saying were different things. That this was an intentional policy decision to control certain groups of people. And what COVID-19 has really highlighted for us, it's really highlighted the fault lines of the way that race drives policy decisions and investment in communities. Black people are not predisposed to COVID. Latino people are not predisposed to COVID. Indigenous people are not predisposed to COVID. What we are predisposed is to structural inequities. And COVID exacerbates structural inequities. And because those populations are the ones that are predisposed to structural inequities, therefore, their fatalities associated with COVID-19 have increased. This is not coincidence. This is not perchance. This is by intentional design. And what COVID has also highlighted is the way that the drug war has further exacerbated those structural inequities when it's come to access to healthcare, when it comes to folks that struggle with addiction being in congregate housing, either in jails prisons, homeless shelters, or are unhoused, all of which are people that are facing higher incidences of contracting COVID-19 and also dying, right? And those things are predicated based on the fact that the drug war has built the infrastructure for those people to be even more at risk. And so I think for us at Drug Policy Alliance, the conversation in building out the narrative about how the drug war is showing up in our world has focused us to recognize that the drug war is not about drugs, but it is an issue at the intersection of racial justice, health, justice, and autonomy. Understanding that this is not just about drug law enforcement, but also giving the people the opportunity and the full autonomy of their bodies to make the choices that they want. And what we've seen with the drug war is the state interrupting those decision points for our communities in ways that they don't do to folks in higher social classes or folks that are white. And so it's important for us to see this, and it's critically important because the U.S. drives so much of the international conversation around drugs. And so we not only write the laws overwhelmingly, we export the laws, and then we fund the laws in other parts of the country. And so as we see, and the work that Drug Policy Alliance is doing is actually figuring out how to be a better international partner, because the racial history of drug law enforcement in the US is not unique. It's actually exported all across the country. And the story doesn't start, and it's not only written by the US context, it's written by this global commitment to anti-Black racism, anti-indigeneity, and the controlling and punishment of people that are poor. And queer. And so we're recognizing that in this conversation, COVID-19 really exports and highlights the fault lines of structural inequities that are proliferated by our response to drugs and drug policy.
Thank you very much, Cassandra. I give the floor now to Simon. Simon, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Cassandra, too, for that laying bare what happens in the States and pivoting to suggest that it is a global phenomena, a white supremacist phenomena that uses drugs policy to suppress, to oppress African, Asians, Caribbeans. Let's not also forget Gypsy, Roma, and Traveler, other Black and brown people, in the most brutal way. Well, Chair, as you said, it has been a most extraordinary year. In many ways, we've had two pandemics. The first one, as Cassandra said, was COVID-19 and the way that it's bears structural inequalities. But the other one, of course, has been George Floyd. Watching a Black man die in front of our eyes, taking 8 minutes, is about as gut-wrenching as it can be. And what we understood clearly across the world, that it wasn't just the knee that killed George Floyd. It was the American system. An American system that had weaponized law enforcement to use with impunity and to cause not just his death, but many, many deaths. And the whole world was convulsed and demanded action. Now, here in the UK, we were dealing with COVID-19, and every day we were seeing Black and brown faces, the faces of those on the front line who had died for COVID-19. As Cassandra said, they were not susceptible to this disease, but they were overly exposed because of the racialized elements of our society. Let me say this fact, which to me it brings to life what we were dealing with in terms of the weaponizing of drugs policy. In May of this year, we were in total lockdown. So 95% of society was in lockdown in their house. In regards to policing of Black communities, stop and search went up 25% to Black people. So when everyone was in their houses, the police had little or nothing to do. They were driving around when Black people were taking a walk, stopping and searching them. And what was the blunt instrument for stopping and search? drugs policy. They would say, we can smell marijuana, we can smell cannabis, and then the brutalization, the humiliation of stop and search that laid bare the fact that whilst everybody was in home, black people were stopped and searched 19 times more than black people. So what does that do to us? Well, it does a number of things. One, it makes people resist against authority, resist against the police, to say they're not there to protect us, they are there to harass us. But it also tells white society too, not even subtly, who are the enemies in our society? Who are the criminals? So this subliminal effect about who is the good guys, who are the bad guys, persists in the poisoning that holds tight within any racist society. And so we've been calling on our government, we call upon the UN to do a number of things. First and foremost, to acknowledge the brutality of this racist drugs policy. Black people take less drugs than white people, and yet black people are stopped and searched and frisked for drugs 19 times more. For me, as an activist for 30 years, one of the things that worries me is that this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. This targeting of young black men. When I look at the youth incarceration at the present is 50% black and brown youths, even though we only make up 15%. Now imagine if that translates to a broader prison population, that you can see that it is a conveyor belt of talented young men whose lives get brutalized by drugs policy. Look, we've said to governments, we've said to the UN that we need to ensure that policing is by consent. They use their resources to catch the criminals, and they stop racially profiling black communities on a wholesale level.
Thank you very much, Simon. And I think it's very important that you contextualize the whole issue. And it's highly important that you draw the attention on what is happening in the UK, because we know that you have been fighting back and mobilizing the community. Now, one point which is important is really to highlight the political dimension of drug, the policy of drug as a political issue of instrumentalization in this context. So I think that point also has to be kept in mind in the following discussions. Thank you very much, Simon. And I give the floor now to Shayla. Shayla, you have the floor.
Hi, thank you, Jaime. Thank you all. I'm learning a lot in this event. Great to hear from you, Simon, Sandra. I'm Sheila Carvalho. I'm a human rights lawyer here in Brazil. I advocate for Black Coalition for Rights, or Coalizão Negra por Derechos. That is an articulation between more than 150 Black movements, Black organizations here in Brazil to work together to promote political actions against the Black genocide. I'm very happy to do this talk with you today because we know that the drug policy we have today is an effective instrument to Black genocide. When you're talking about the Brazilian context, it's pretty aggressive how this political works to kill and incarcerate Black people. There's a very common, profoundly racialized discourse that must be challenging here, and probably global, as Cassandra said. One that intentionality associates Black people, especially young people, to drugs and violence. We cannot help, however, to point that the Brazilian state's actions justify by the war paradigm corroborate and accentuate pre-existence vulnerabilities and violations linked to race, gender, generations, and class here in Brazil. There's a punitive architecture, based on a set of practice of control that interact with the construction of the prohibitist paradigm. This architecture has important elements for our observations and implications for the reproductions of the conditions of life or death, which are informed by one's racial identity in the world today. I don't know if you know about this, but we have a law or law on drugs is very selective. They establish that the police officer will define if a person is a dealer or is a user of drugs. And what we're seeing is that Black people who live in favelas are associated as dealers, and while that white people who live in privileged areas are associated as user and don't be charged, don't be taken to the police officer, nothing happens with them. We have today a case pending in our Supreme Court to decriminalize the use of drugs, and this selective of our justice systems appears in the Supreme Court discussion, but we don't have a position yet. This year, our Superior Court of Justice, that is the Brazil's highest appellate court for no constitutional matters, grant a collective action to hand down sentences in secure person facilities to people convicted of the crime known as privileged trafficking. What it means that the first-time offenders with good records and no connections to criminal organizations. This is a great victory for us because we estimate that more than 100,000 people, especially women, are in prison today for this so-called privileged trafficking. We have a research called Prison at Any Cost that was made by two Brazilian organizations, Connectas Human Rights and Institute of Defense, which shows that our justice systems continues to hand out disproportionately harsh punishments for privileged trafficking compared to other non-violent offenses with the same sentence. We know what is these intentions means that this tentative to stay deprived and liberty of Black people, something that we live here since our abolitions, since our slavery abolishment. We have our situation that is the increased number of killing by police at favelas. This is well known by all of you, and I will not taking long relate of this, but there is a connection in the pandemic situation because here in Brazil, during the period of the pandemic, the period that was more rigorous related to quarantine measures, the police violence in our favelas increased more than 40% during the months of March and April of this year. This was the fundamental for action at the Supreme Court that established the suspension of any action of the police in the favelas to combat the organized crime related to drugs during the pandemic. But this measure, this measure by the Supreme Court is not being implemented by the state of the Rio de Janeiro, a federated state here in Brazil. I was talking a little bit more, but I will
Okay,
let
Sheila.
you. But our mission is to create awareness about these issues and to create awareness of how the drug policies is being used as instruments to kill and incarcerate Black people.
Thank you very much, Sheila, and I appreciate because Brazil is a case in point, because Brazil is is a geographical point of encounter of racism and slavery, very profound. As a special rapporteur, I did investigate racism in Brazil and met Lula and issued a strong report. So what is happening in Brazil is a very important case in point we have to examine very closely. And I give now the floor to Aquila. Aquila, you have the floor. Just 5 minutes if you wish. Thank you very much.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. And I'm just really appreciating the conversation, the different perspectives from Brazil to the UK. Cassandra, just kind of framing the whole conversation around this war on drugs in the US, which has essentially been a war on people, and a war specifically on Black and brown folks. There is a direct correlation between this war on drugs and, like I said, the war on people and how it impacted the work that I've done for the past 30 years in the States with gangs, right? In the early to mid 80s, we had an explosion of gang violence, that happened on the streets in the US. We consider it as social justice activists one of the longest running wars in the history of this country. In LA County alone, we're talking about between 1983 and 2003, 30,000 gang-related deaths. Doesn't include those who have been permanently maimed or those who are incarcerated for the rest of their life behind their participation. It's been a public health epidemic, a mental health epidemic, but because the victims and the perpetrators have been Black and brown youth and young adult, and we live in a country that's built on structural violence and systemic racism and implicit bias, our cries have consistently fell on deaf ears. And so it put in effect this false narrative that they call Black on Black violence, Black on Black crime. It's a false narrative. Black folks pay billions of dollars into public safety infrastructures in cities all across this country. And why are we now responsible for our own safety in our own neighborhoods? Based upon this false narrative of Black on Black violence and on gangs, right? We know that our kids we didn't give ourselves that label. Society gave that label to these young Black and brown folks who didn't speak the common language of the system. And this was their cry out for help, right? And so the system labeled them as gangs. Less than 3 to 5% of so-called gang members. And this was a report that was done by a prominent civil rights attorney, Connie Rice, in the city of Los Angeles, looked at gang violence in the city of LA and discovered that less than 3 to 5% of so-called gang members was actually committing violent crimes and murder. And a large percentage of that 3 to 5% had serious mental health issues that never were addressed, whether they were in community or when they were incarcerated. So this label actually dehumanizes the person behind it, gangs, right? And it desensitizes the public to the plight, of these individuals. Because it's easy to label someone. We can call them insurgents. We can call them, immigrants or illegal aliens, right? Or we can call them gang members. And it's okay to harm them, right? The first 3 stories on the news, in the US is mostly about violence that's happening in the neighborhoods. And the media kind of constructs this whole thing in partnership with our, like police industrial complex, right? And they say that it'll be a story that says 3 gang members were shot and killed on Central and 103rd, and people will be like, kill them again, or they deserve it. We need to rid our culture and our society of these, these evildoers. And the reality is that if they said 3 14-year-old boys were shot and killed on Central and 103rd, people would be like, oh my God, those 14-year-old gang members those gang members were those 14-year-old kids, right? But again, we utilize language and labels in order to desensitize the public to the plight. The public execution of George Floyd is an inflection point in terms of public safety in this country. There's a direct correlation between public safety and public health, right? Never again will law enforcement be a single point of contact for safety in our respective communities. Law enforcement has co-opted the movement. You say police and people say public, you say public safety and people say police. When the reality is that the police are only one aspect of the public safety process. You can't have public safety without the public. Crime stats are a terrible way of trying to determine whether or not people feel safe in their respective communities. And we have to acknowledge that safety is different for Black folks in this country than it is for white folks. This is a reality. Black folks have never really felt safe in the U.S., because of structural violence and institutional racism and systemic, systemic racism. And so to me, these issues around public health and public safety should be conflated, right? Because here's the thing, when during the pandemic here in Newark, we, the mayor deemed us essential workers from the very beginning at the start. We witnessed what was happening in New York with officers being given the responsibility of asking people to shelter in place and to wear PPEs. It increased was it increased, one, their overtime, which was taxpayers paying money. It also increased excessive force and misconduct issues in which taxpayers pay the money, right? And so the mayor and our police public safety director in the city was like, hey, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to deploy the community as the front line of defense. If we're talking about violence as a public health issue, right? And public health. Violence is a public health issue is not a tagline, right? It's there's serious trauma, that's happening in people's lives on the ground. And so if you deploy cops who are traumatized and stressed to poor people who are overly traumatized and stressed, what do you think is going to happen? And so I think that it was genius, that our mayor, public safety director, some of our key players in the city decided that community would be the first line of defense and engage the public. We bought food, we bought PPEs, because there was an assumption being made that people weren't wearing PPEs because they were just being defiant. They didn't know that these people were poor and they didn't have it, and we utilized a relationship-based strategy to ask people to wear PPPs and to shelter in place, because it's the best way. It's like those who are closest in proximity. This is the public health model to the disease. Should be equipped with the skills and the tools and the know-how, right, in terms of being able to eradicate it. And we consistently see that this doesn't happen in our culture. It's so backwards, right? I'm the proponent of community-based public safety. There's always been a complementary strategy and alternative to policing in this country. Over 200 cities across the country have community-based public safety initiatives that have evidence-based results, practice-based results, that shows that community actually reduces violence and crime without collateral damage, without unintended consequences, much better than police. But we have an extremely powerful law enforcement lobby in this country that leverages its against, in terms of human advancement, in this country. But I think, again, we're having significant conversation that we're in terms of our collective.
Thank you, Akila. Thank you, because I think it's very important that you share with us your reflection in the present day context, because the United States is a very meaningful scene of how racism is impacting and how profoundly it is shaping the society and the behavior of the law enforcement institutions. So I very much appreciate it also. Akila, you're highlighting the public health and public safety, the link of the two. It's very highly important. Thank you very much for doing it. Now, I do think that it's highly important that you made the point, which is we have to take into account in our discussion how the communities facing this reality have shaped their own reactions and policies. to try to settle their own problem. So this is very important. The mobilization, the inner mobilization of the societies to find solutions to these issues. So thank you very much. Now, if you agree, I would like now to get back to all the panelists for thoughts and reaction to what have been said. I will simply add also that I would like to put 2 or 3 points to help in the discussion. One, I think it's very important to keep in mind that certainly racism is the intellectual construction, but it has a social impact and it is a political instrument. And in time of crisis, these 3 factors play together. So this is why we have to keep in mind also the drug has been used not only to weaken the community's concern in the way they are reacting to racism, because drug is something, it has been a political arm in many ways, in many countries, and certainly in the United States. But we have also to keep in mind that drug is reveal the way the policy, the image, the use of drug, because we are in the context of the post-COVID-19. The main lesson, the main factor which is emerging of the COVID-19 context is the very strong emergence of the social impact, the increase of poverty, the fact that we are going to go through many years of social marginalization and poverty, which means that in this context, certainly drug will be a key issue in this context. Now, just to conclude, in this context of COVID-19, I draw your attention also on what I call the 2 maps. The map of social, political, and economic marginalization coincide with the ethnic map. Those who are marginalized politically, economically, and socially are the victims of the ethnic victim of racism and discrimination. So we are seeing the tightening of these 2 maps. So the tightening, the deep tightening of these 2 maps is a key point in our discussion. So now I give the floor to Cassandra for thoughts and reactions.
So I think the points
Cassandra,
that you, yes, I think the points that you have laid out are exactly right. Because I think to your point, or your second point around, your third point around the maps tightening, the maps tightening is often what creates the predisposition to a drug crisis. So when we see, the current moment right now, when we're looking at the overdose crisis that the U.S. is in, where we have nearly 70,000 people that are dying every year from overdose, if we overlay the maps of where overdose is and overlay the maps of deindustrialization, poor access to healthcare, food insecurity, homelessness, we're looking at the same communities. And so folks are trying to deal with the fact that people are dying, but are not trying to have the conversation about why those people are in, what were the circumstances that created that marginalization. Which means that this larger conversation around race and COVID-19 and drugs cannot happen without me naming the role that capitalism plays in setting the table in the way that these policies are proliferated. And I think that the role, the market in creating the widening gaps between the haves and the have-nots have created a lot of the circumstances that we're trying to navigate through, and our responses don't do enough to disrupt how the table is being set. And therefore, we focus on drugs. And so as an organization that works to end drug prohibition, even the reforms we are fighting for still operate under the praxis of marginalization of groups. So our reforms aren't even to eliminate marginalization, it's just to reduce them, which is important, but it really highlights the need for us to have the conversation about what does it look like for us to eliminate the marginalization between communities, and that is not a far out ideal goal, but that should be what we are working towards.
Thank you very much, Cassandra. I would like to ask Simon now for force and reaction, and I invite you also to address, if possible, the issue of how the UN should address the whole issue in the present day context. It's highly important. Simon, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Chair. I mean, look, what has been, I must say, disappointing for me over some years, that the drugs policy movement, up until very recently, has never really fully acknowledged the fact that punitive drugs policy is at its sharpest end, being war on black and brown people. And sometimes we've had to argue that the decriminalization of drugs, which we've always welcomed, will not fundamentally alter the systemic white supremacist system. But what we have strongly argued for, Chair, is this, is that when we see punitive drugs policy aimed at black and brown people around the world, that is the sharpest end, the most brutal end. Prisons, in death, in gangs, etc., etc. But if we pivot back and all those dots lead back to the system of government, of business, then we begin to tackle the source. And the source is systemic racism, systemic inequality in education, in housing, in health, in the police force. So the UN, acknowledging that and wanting answers, has to say that it's not just drugs they need to tackle, but the systems within our countries that propagate deep-seated racism. And a key element for success, I would argue, Chair, is the political and economic empowerment of those communities in that country. Because without us, things are done to us and not for us. So we've been arguing here in the UK with Operation Black Vote that we need political power, we need to be at the table, and we need to tackle the big fundamental aspects of race inequality.
Thank you very much, Simon. I think it's very important, the point you made, because the decriminalization of drug is not enough. We have to keep in mind that there is a political dimension, the political instrumentalization of drug, which is a very important point to keep in mind, because when we are talking about systemic racism, the actors of this system are first the political forces, but secondly the social certainly force, and also the media. And the media in this context are a very powerful voice to highlight the way the impact of the use of drug in certain discriminated community, putting the emphasis.
I would also add this. Think about this for a second, for one second. There are many black people languishing life imprisonment for selling cannabis. Life imprisonment, 3 strikes and you're out. Today, white multinationals are making tens of millions, if not billions of dollars on cannabis. And so you see how the system pivots when it suits them to make millions of dollars, and when it's against us, it's life imprisonment.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Simon. But I want to just repeat the last point I was making. In a systematic racism, no, that's okay, it's very fine. In a systematic racism context, one key actor is the media. And the media, as we have seen in many countries, they highlight the use of drug by discriminated community in a criminal way, by literally pinpointing these communities and really putting the finger to them, to these communities, and in a way giving to the law and enforcement institutions a kind of free hand to use a fight against the drug as a pretext of strengthening the system. So these points are highly important. Sheila, you have the floor, and address also the way the United Nations should address the whole issue. Thank you, Sheila.
Thank you, Dana. I think it's important to just emphaticate that the war on drugs did not invent racism. But the drug policy is the result of centers and centers of racism that naturalize the various forms of violence that affect Black people the most. This is what I'm hearing here. And as a Black movement, when you're talking about design a new drug policy, we're talking about life, to defend the right of life. So discriminalize, it's not enough. Legalize, it's not enough. What we're talking about is regulate. Because I think we have to talk about education measures, health measures to this drug policy that don't put the Black life in danger. As Cassandra said, in relation to these marginalized groups, who will be affected the most with if you just legalize drugs and okay, everyone will be access to drugs. We have to think the impact of the legalized in Black communities and poor communities that will not have access to a good health care and good educational information to the appropriate use of drugs. We want to stop the killing lives of Black people. And when you think about this policy, we have to think about the other measures that we have to take apart when you're speaking about legalization. And I think the UN have this role to put together a dialogue, an open dialogue about this, and connecting movements, connecting organization, research, and improve what we can discuss in the international forum. Because what we see now is a legislation, international legislation that is totally unconnected to our reality. And we're seeing the capital, we're seeing a drug market raising in the world without any control. And Simon put that precisely. A drug market, the Black people doesn't take part, doesn't profit from that. So the Black economic exclusion take part again when you're talking about the drug reform. I think that, Dana.
Thank you very much, Sheila. And I think it's really important that you and Simon, you touch on a very central point. And one key dimension we have to keep in mind is that the political instrumentalization of drug in combating the selling and the use of drug, but in utilizing that combat to legitimize the violence of the law enforcement institution, to use it as a mask. So I think it really absolutely important to highlight that point. And because I wanted to add again before giving the floor on to Akila, that let us not forget the media, because the reading of the media of the way the minorities, racialized victim of racism, are fighting back. The way the reading they highlight, the picture they give is a picture of violence, of drug users. They never go to the deep root causes of this violence. So this is an important factor we have to integrate in our discussion. So Akila, please, you have the floor.
Yes, sir. Just first on the media, there's a trifecta between the media, law enforcement, and academia. Their collective work together kind of sustains and perpetuates structural violence, in our communities. Understanding, the roles of each one of those institutions and how they work together is critical to be able to dismantle, the institutional racism and white supremacy, straight up. This issue has been really personal for me because, my brother has been in 15 years now, and he's serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole for conspiracy to sell drugs. They didn't catch him with nothing. He didn't have anything. They caught a friend of his with 200 pounds of marijuana, and he got life without the possibility of parole, So it's like, the policies in this country, of course, are broken. The impact that these policies have had on folks in neighborhoods, especially people who are part of so-called gangs. Gangs are surrogate families. They're not inherently negative, that's killing people and robbing people. People tend to think that gangs are like the mafia, that they're centralized and organized and they have armories and treasuries. The federal government utilizes this, to arrest whole swaths of people. So my brother got caught up in a 21-person conspiracy. They had racketeering, RICO, all of this stuff in there because they say that gangs sell drugs to control the criminal enterprise. Let me tell you, I grew up in the projects. I grew up with gangs all my life. I don't know not one individual who sells drugs for a gang. People sell drugs for themselves because it's a quality of life situation to make ends meet. They sell drugs for themselves and they claim the gang and they claim the neighborhood. It's a really important distinction, to make because we're talking about people who are living in war zones, high levels of traumatic stress disorder, hypervigilance, vicarious trauma, and very little access, because we're talking about a broken public health system to healing. Nowadays, when you go to the doctor in the U.S. and say, hey, I'm having an emotional psychological break and I need some therapy, I need to talk to someone, they prescribe you drugs. They get you hooked on pharmaceuticals and psychotropics. There is no more talk therapy. And even though that, and for forever, that Eurocentric kind of frame around healing has been pushed on us, and we need to expand the cachet of healing services as well, because here's the thing, that they're going to, they utilize drugs to criminalize, young men and women on the streets who don't have access to participation in the mainstream and being able to support themselves. People are traumatized and stressed. They're going to utilize, they're going to self-medicate, when you don't have access to healthcare, to real healthcare. And people are being criminalized, as a result of it. But I think that in Newark, we've developed like a strategy, and this is nothing new. We just kind of organized, and codified like practices and are delivering them in a certain type of way that's had a huge impact on the city here in terms of violence. And now we're working on this whole piece around, social equity. The state of New Jersey just legalized recreational use of marijuana, but there was no social equity model that was built into it, as they're doing in different states across the country. There's Black men and women, who have been incarcerated, for selling marijuana, and there's no amnesty. Neither is there, being investment put up so that those who used to, being in the illegal trade of selling cannabis can now, be a part of this reformed, now that they're saying, oh, it's cool, you can use it recreationally, that they can be involved, in the economic development aspect of it as well. And as my brother was saying, the institutional, the white supremacy permeates all of this stuff, and it's extremely difficult. People kind of correlate like white supremacy with racism, and I'm like, yo, we need to unpack those things, because there's a lot of white folks out here, who be feeling like, oh, like when I language white supremacy, they're like, oh, it's, I'm not racist, and I'm like, and I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about a system, that actually that disadvantages all of us, including white people who have bought into the idea of supremacy.
Thank you very much, Akila, and our compassion and solidarity for your brother, because it is a terrible situation, and really our thought with him, and hope and praying that he may get out of it. And now I would like to make one point, because to try to focus more on what the UN should do. And for that, I just have one idea I would like to put on the table before giving the floor to Ma'am for the question which are posed by the audience. I think it is very important to take the United States the case. You know, the United States is absolutely the present day administration very critical of the United Nations, and they have weakened the United Nations. But one key element of strategy for the UN to address the issue is one, the human rights structure is based on political rights, which are crimes, violence, killings, etc. But there are the social and economic rights. So it is highly important that we push in our recommendation the need for the UN to give more strength to the promotion and realization of social and economic rights, poverty, education, health, etc. And drug is a part of it. And I think that dimension is still a little bit weak on the work the UN is doing. Now, I would like to ask Ma'am to take the floor for the questions, and after we will try to come back among the panelists to give our reaction to the questions. Ma'am, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Jen, and thank you to all the panelists for this really engaging conversation. We will now be taking questions from the audience. Those are broad, open-ended questions that are addressed to all panelists and not one specifically. So if you would like to speak, please raise your hand and I will pass the microphone over to you accordingly. And this first question from Mavis in the audience actually puts in perspective what Mr. Jen was just asking in relation to the UN. And her question is as follows. What do you see as the two largest obstacles in pushing through such policy direction change in tackling structural racism in the UN? Do you see a gap between the higher awareness through Black Lives Matter and the policymakers in the UN arriving to such structural change? So my understanding is the question is asking about the gap between what is happening on the streets versus the higher level decision-making bodies at the UN and how this can be gapped through the work of activists and on the ground and as such as you all. So please, I will take Cassandra, if you would like to answer first, since you didn't have the opportunity to answer on the UN question before. I'll let you take the floor and then pass it over to our other panelists as they would like. Thank you.
Cassandra, you have the floor.
Thank you. So I would say that it's very clear that there is an obvious gap between what grassroots organizing is happening on the level, I would say, in the U.S. context and civil society in the UN. I think that part of the thing that we have to navigate is the body of the UN and the role that it plays and how it can move. The UN tends to be a lot slower than the dynamics that are on the ground that we're navigating. And so I find that it has been difficult to lobby in a different way. But I also think that for us, I think American advocates, while they do work on the UN, what I have seen is a focus on our federal government. But I think that's part of the role that American advocates have to play to be better global citizens and being more accountable to international allies that are using the UN as a organizing tool to move things forward. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Cassandra. Simon, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. The first thing I would say about the Black Lives Matter protest, I've never seen anything like it in my lifetime. This is a 21st century global civil rights movement, global. And in that manifestation, that those marching on the streets, those tearing down statues, are not asking our governments and the United Nations, but they are demanding a reset. Never before have structural inequalities been laid so bare? The history of nations been laid bare? The question is, how will the United Nations respond? Will it put its head in the sand, or will it step up as leaders to say, this is our moment too? Our moment as a global institution to make demands on our members as never before. The demands that we have to make on Brazil, for example, when we see black people living in intolerable situations and dying under such brutality, that we say to that state, it's time for fundamental change. The UN is the global leader. It needs to lead. It needs to demand that all its members have race equality programs, tackle fundamental discriminatory practices, make the demands. It's no longer good enough to tinker around the edges. Please be nice, please, please. No, no, no. Now is the time that people looking forward, people in 50 years' time will look at 2020 and ask but one question. What was the response? What was the response for this perfect storm that we saw through COVID-19, through George Floyd, through the oppression of black and brown people around the world? I hope that the United Nations will step up.
Thank you very much, Simon. I just want to give a first answer to that question. It's very important, Simon, to say that I'm working inside the United Nations. I was for a long time, 25 years in UNESCO. So working all the intellectual basis of all this discrimination and domination, and now on human rights very much. So what I would like to say is that the UN is trying to tackle it in a very profound way. And the civil society is very active in the UN working and mechanism very strongly. And I think that something is emerging very strongly. But one point which may be missing is a very close link between the political, as I said, rights and the social and economic right, and trying to enlarge the perception and analysis on why people are using drugs, in what social context, in what political context, and how law enforcement forces are used, etc., to legitimize through the fight against drug, racism and discrimination. So I think something is going on, but I think that the UN has certainly to do much more. Shayla, I give you the floor. Shayla.
Thank you, Daim. I believe fighting on the racist, it's not a joke. When people are asking and people are demanding fire on the racist, they are not joking. I think we are in another state. And as a person that builds black movements, I see the our organization or movements don't want to talk anymore. Like, they want action, they want proposals, they are demand. I think Simon was precisely on that. But I have to, as a black movement in Brazil or at the South Global, I have to create awareness about how it's important to understand that this fight is global, and how important it is to hear from us, from the South. We were also screaming that Black Lives Matter. We also building, demanding actions, and people, especially at these international forums, international debates, they have a tendency to forget that we are resistant. I know as Brazilian we have a barrier, a language barrier. Not most of the people in Brazil don't speak English, don't speak Spanish. It's close, but it's not so close. And as a Black movement, historically, we have been challenged and how to make our voices be heard at UN. So you have to think about this other experience, these other demands, these other movements. We're screaming here, we're screaming at Nigeria. We need to be heard. When you're talking about Brazil, police violence in the United States against Afro-descendants is horrible. But in Brazil, you kill 5 times more, or police kills 5 times more. And we don't heard about this at this international debate. So I think it's important to globalize our struggle and all against racism.
Thank you very much, Sheila. Akila?
Yes, I would just add that the UN should just help to facilitate more opportunities for our respective communities, the UK, Brazil, because I think that what's emerging on the ground in multiple cities around the world is the solution. And the thing is that I don't think that that this new emergence of new leaders are having an opportunity to communicate and talk more. And I think that we have to develop, to Sheila's point, develop better tools and means and ways for us to be able to communicate across cultures and across language. Because I think that we're all being impacted by very similar things. I spend a lot of time in Brazil, traveling back and forth, and seeing like kind of the impact that violence and poverty and all of these things that's happening have on folks in Salvador. I'm like, it's very similar. And sometimes like my friends there are like, oh, I want to come to the US because it's like this and that. And I'm like, no. I'm like, the cost of freedom in the US is your soul. I'm like, don't buy into the things that we see on the media. I'm like, because for us and for people who don't have means, I'm like, it's a different type of reality that exists for us in the US. But as I was saying, just about the work that I've been doing around community-based public safety, developing complementary strategies to policing, this is a global conversation because, Black people all over the planet don't feel safe in the communities in which they live. And there are systems now that exist that we can train residents who are the true first responders. They live in the neighborhoods in which they serve. They're not parachuting in and parachuting out. If we invest in them utilizing the public health frame, we shift the reality. I think that we have to do a ground up strategy, because most of it has been like we're talking to these high level important people and asking them to translate and communicate down. And there's something that's getting lost in the translation, right? It's not trickling down. So we got to meet, and so significant investment has to be made in the ground and in people like who are innovating on the new ways in which we're doing public health and public safety. So that's what I would say.
Thank you very much, Akila. Just some more points. One, I think, very important to remind all of us is the context. I do think that we are living in a context where maybe in few years ahead, they will talk about the post-COVID-19 era, because something is happening. And in line with what Simon has said, I think that the connection or the coincidence between the confinement of most of our societies and the confinement means silence. Confinement means the self and the deeper thinking, inner reflection, individually and collectively, for several weeks. And the coincidence of this silence and the inner reflection with, at the end of the confinement, the witnessing of the crime and the killing of George Floyd. I think that the coincidence of these two events have triggered what I think we all agree, the extraordinary move worldwide against racism, because it reveals the depth and the brutality of what racism means, being killed by law enforcement institutions and individuals. And I think that one hopeful dimension we have to keep in mind is this multiracial, multi-ethnical mobilization. We have seen in the streets of New York, as Paris and elsewhere, people coming from all age or from all backgrounds, from all walks of life, fighting, taking conscience of the reality of racism, of its brutality, and mobilizing to fight it. We saw it here in Paris, in France, very, very strongly. So I think that we have to highlight that context. We are entering now a context of conscience, collective conscience, which goes beyond ethnicity, the usual divide, social divide. My second point is that the UN, certainly, we have to help the UN to get more involved. And I think UN has one first point of the UN action is a legal action, is strengthening and implementing the international instruments which the UN has drafted and adopted against racism and drug, on food, on all these issues, strengthening them in a very important. The second point is a linking between the political right and the social and economic right, to link them very profoundly. The third one is really to give more strength to the different specialized agencies of the UN. UNESCO, for example, there is no doubt, has a big challenge on how education should be used, not only to fight racism, but to fight or uncover and document the deep root causes of the use of drug, linking racism, poverty, and drug. And the WHO, the World Health Organization, has certainly to go beyond the medical dimension of health and touching on the deep root causes of health and the psychological, the social sources and expression of health. So I think they are all starting to engage on that issue. But it's very important that the social organizations, the civil society, be more active in the United Nations and bringing ideas. And organizations like the Open Society and all of you to be more active in the participation of the UN. And I think all organizations of UN are open to get these new ideas. But I conclude by saying that we are entering an era of conscience, and that those issues we have been debating are now more visible, and we have to continue fighting to give them more visibility. More visibility means deconstructing them and trying to highlight their deep root causes and their expression. But the key picture, the key challenge is to unlock the two maps which are very closely linked. The map of social, economic, and political rights. The map of invisibility and silence, to unlock it from the ethnic map. Because for the time being, in all these societies, these maps are closely linked, very tightly linked, to untightening them. So I think it is a challenge. And in this very profound dimension, I think drug has to be highlighted. And in conclusion, I repeat that combat racism has two pillars: the intellectual construction and the ideological legitimation and the political instrumentalization, but it has the social, economic impact and the psychological impact. And thus, those two dimensions have to be absolutely put more operationally, more strongly together to give some answer to the issue. But I do think that we are living in an era where I think all issues are put on the table now, and the people are moving. And I am very happy to have heard from all of you the way the communities are reacting, the inner mobilization of the community to find their own solutions. And this is an important factor. So these are the points. If any of you would like to make some conclusion before I give the floor back to Ma'am. Simon?
Well, like you, brother, I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful because we've seen a movement which has been white, black, and brown, has been global, and has been intense. I've been an activist for over 30 years, and I would say, Chair, that I've never known so many white people, many in positions of power, begin to look at life through a Black Lives lens, in which we no longer have to convince every single person that systemic racism exists, but rather, what can we do about it? That is a very good position to be in, and we need to seize that moment. I have one caveat, though.
Please.
There are many people that are willing to engage in conversations as we've never had before. The pushback is already begun. The pushback on notions of white privilege, the pushback on the fatigue of Black Lives Matter is already emerging. And as you highlighted beforehand, people are feeling threatened about that if we win, they argue they lose. A faux culture war. Nothing could be from the truth, but we have to be aware of the opportunities, but also the challenges. I would conclude on this, that with drugs policy, punitive drugs policy, we see the sharp end of state brutality. If you tackle that and then go backwards to its institutions, great things will happen. Great opportunities will occur. Which, Chair, we must always tell anyone that will listen, everybody benefits. Not just about people who look like you and me. It's about our whole society.
Thank you, Simon. Excellent. I give now the floor to Cassandra. Cassandra? 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 Yes, please.
Yes, hello? Okay. So I would say we have to be super clear about what it is that we are fighting for. As the chair has said multiple times, drugs are a political instrument. And Sheila, I totally appreciate what you're saying. We could end the drug war tomorrow, and the issues that our communities would be facing would still be intact. There
Absolutely.
would be, or there would be something else that they would replace drugs with. They would replace the political instrument. And so there's a conversation about us actually having the conversation about how do we end the marginalization of our communities? How do we build the institutions that are actually going to do that with us? How do we stop asking institutions that are not actually based? Stop asking the institutions that have reinforced and created the marginalization to reverse, right? Because they're just going to figure out how to do it in a different way. And what does the world look like when we win? And in order for our communities to win, multiple movements have to have the same conversation. And so it means that we're going to have to build tables together that are actually more focused on white supremacy. And Lord Woolley, I'm very excited to say that the work that we're doing at Drug Policy Alliance with our partners are recognizing this point, that race and class are central to this issue, and that drugs are the instrument. They are not the thing that is killing us.
Thank you very much, Cassandra. Sheila? Sheila?
Hi. I was trying to unmute. I think, as Cassandra said, was perfectly, our challenging is way big. We don't know how will be the next instrument of oppression. If you don't use this moment as open as a window to, as an opportunity to create a new world. I think we are talking about rupture, because you're leaving this marginalization, this exclusion for centuries and centuries, and each century they have a new mechanism of how to oppress Black people. In this century, we live in this by the drug policy, but when you look at the history, this has been done in so many different ways. So I think we have this moment to take this as an opportunity to do this global fight and stay for our lives. Like, our lives matter. We need more than not just being killed. We're talking about health, we're talking about education, we're talking about job, we're talking about the good living. Our focus now is how to survive. We don't even talk about how to really live, and how to improve our communities, our Black communities. I think we have this as a challenge to think in this new world, and for now we just have to design a new drug policy that stop killing explicitly Black people, but without forget that it will be possibly used to continue to marginalize our bodies, our lives, our livings, and we have to think how to create a new way to stop the blood. I don't have a other way to say that.
Thank you very much, Sheila. Very good. Akila, you have the floor.
Yes, sir. I would just share that that there are real solutions that are emerging, out of this perfect storm, and we need to lift them up more. We need to invest in them. We need to invest in the infrastructure. We need to invest in the leadership, and then we need to export, those kind of best practices and systems around the world. I'm a big believer in systems that measure impact. However, I also understand how when I talked about the trifecta with law enforcement and media and academia, academia just has played such a strategic role in the sustaining of white supremacy and structural violence against our communities, that we have to have more conversations about how we unpack the instruments that they use to define our reality in our respective communities. So research, has been one of those tools that's been used. And evidence-based, practices has also been one of those tools that's used to silence the voice of practitioners and individuals who are living, in, the conflict and have the best strategies and ideas to overcome it. But we have to give up our genius and our intelligence over to PhDs earning tenure, who extract all of our genius and knowledge and put them in reports and share them in reviews, and then all of a sudden they become famous. And the very people who are implementing the solutions on the ground and who are running the programs aren't even recognized or seen. And so, we have to get past academia, media, and kind of electeds. In the U.S., elected officials are celebrities. You know what I'm saying? And instead of civil servants. And I have this position that you work for me, and I recognize your celebrity, but it doesn't overtake the role that I've elected you to do, and I will hold you accountable. And this is where we have to get back to. I think there are really comprehensive, impactful solutions that are happening on the ground, and we have to invest in them and we have to export them.
Thank you very much, Akila.
Not from the U.S., not just from the U.S. I'm saying from other places around the world. We in the U.S. we have so much to learn, learn. From other countries. We think that we're at the pinnacle and that we know shit, but it's crazy how ignorant we are as Americans.
Thank you very much, Akila. I think that we all made really the very fundamental issues, and I would like to repeat that we are entering a new era, an era of consciousness, and an era of revelation of racism, what it is. Many people who have been walking in the street, protesting in manifestation, were touched emotionally by what they saw on the killing of George Floyd. But all of them did not understand very well or know what racism is and its impact is, and how drug also can play in this picture. So I think we have to open more. The door is opening up. We have to push it more profoundly. Now, race is the central international issues. Now, we have to work through the UN on first, one basic instrument is a legal instrument. Fighting racism through the law, through the law, that's a very, the legal front. Strengthening the international instrument, having them implemented. The second front is the intellectual front, promoting the understanding of the deep root causes of racism. Racism is not coming from the moon or from the planet Mars. It is a social construction. We have to get people to understand that intellectual creation. And understanding the intellectual creation is important. And the third point, we have to highlight one of the things we have achieved in the past years, getting racism declared as a crime against humanity, and slavery as a crime against humanity, and racism as a legitimation of slavery, etc., and how it impacted. So the education, the intellectual front is absolutely important. And another front also is really to deepen and highlight the social and economic impact. The social and economic impact. And I come back to my suggestion of the two maps to do it. But we are in a new era. People are mobilized. We have to get them informed, educated, and continue to be mobilized. And but I think we are started, and it is in this context that the Open Society has had this wonderful idea of having us meet together and try to exchange ideas. I really wish you the best. And Ma'am, do you have something to tell us on conclusion? And Akila, all our solidarity for your brother. Ma'am?
Thank you very, very much, sir, and thank you again to all the panelists and all those in attendance. No, I do not have anything to add. I think this was a very rich conversation and timely conversation. And for those who would like to hear it again and glean more of the insight, it will be available on the OSF website just as soon as we can get all the panelists to sign their release forms. And with that, thank you, everybody. Have a great day and keep the fight alive. Bye.
And God bless you all, and let us keep together. Let us keep together, exchange our work and what we are doing. All of us are doing something. Let us share the information on what we are doing, share it and expand it. That is an important factor, the mobilization among us, us mobilizing the communities, because the first reaction has in the force is the communities, what they do, what how their solutions are. And God bless you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.